We're back. I'm Dave Donaldson. Welcome back to Grip Tips. This is a continuation video of 95A. This is called 95B. If you haven't seen 95A, which is an overall general setup of the Sekonic C-800, I highly recommend that you go back and watch that before going into this next one, as it is a continuation of that one. So yeah, from there, let's go right into it. Okay, so even though text mode is the first menu from left to right, top to bottom, we kind of have to understand the rest of the menus before we can dive into that. So we are going to cover that in a different video, but we'll ignore it for now, as that is more about custom mode. Instead of that, let's first dive into spectrum. Here we have a graph, and if we take a reading of a light, which can be done by hitting the measure button on the side of the meter, an array of colors is going to pop up on this graph. Now, what does this graph tell us? All the colors are wavelengths that the meter has picked up and measured them by nanometers and their intensity. If you look at the bottom of the graph, it has numbers that go from 380 over to 780. Anything in between those numbers is the visible spectrum that you and I can see. Here's an image that I pulled from Google, and as you can see, wavelengths in the world vary, and in the middle is just visible light. But below the 380 nanometer mark is where you get into UV light, X-rays, gamma rays. And if you go above 780, that's when you get into infrared and radio waves, which is pretty neat. We usually look for a continuous spectrum, as a continuous spectrum is taking a pure white light, and if I were to split that white light with a prism, you would see a consistent array of colors, such as Roy G. Biv or Vib G. Bure, whatever, and with no break in between each color. So what we are looking for in this spectrum is no breaks or spikes. Also, what we are looking for in this reading is how intense a color is. So now if I take a pure tungsten source, not an LED switched to 3200 degrees Kelvin, such as my ARRI 150 watt tungsten light, you can see the spectrum ramps up into the red area. However, and a lot of you are going to hate me about this, but it's kind of a true fact, is that this is kind of the reason that LED does not fully replace tungsten or HMI sources. If I take an LED light and switch it to 3200 degrees to match our tungsten source, you could see a pretty significant spike in the blue area. And that doesn't matter what manufacturer you go through, because LEDs, they actually start off as just a blue diode. And all manufacturers, in order to achieve that kind of tungsten kind of look, end up having to dip the LEDs inside of some sort of phosphorus. They dip it in a chemical to get to that tungsten source. So it's kind of like you're starting off with blue and you're gelling it, which is basically what most of the LED companies are doing out there. Where in a regular tungsten source, there's a little bit of blue, but not nearly that intense. So now, why does that matter? Skin tones. Cinematographers always want some sort of warm, nice feeling skin tones. If you were to take, and I mean this is an LED, not a true tungsten source, but if I were to switch it a little bit to just a tiny bit of blue, you're going to notice that I start to look a little bit more pale and dead. Where if I go back to my tungsten source, I start to look a little bit warmer, and that's what cinematographers want. That little tiny blue spike that's coming in through the spectrum is usually what's going to make a cinematographer stray away from an LED, because it just doesn't feel right. And that's because of the tiny little blue diode still leaking through that phosphor chemical, whatever it is. Now that was just kind of a quick, I realized that I'm using an LED, and so I just want to make sure that I'm being very, very clear. Not an LED, an actual tungsten source. Something that you could probably find commonly inside of your house unless you've switched everything over to LED already. But that's why cinematographers prefer an actual tungsten source, is because it gives much pleasing skin tones and no real blue spike inside of it. Something that always kind of feels off or makes a skin tone look a little bit dead, which makes a lot of sense. But the downside is that yes, tungsten sources use a lot more electricity, they get hot, where LEDs, as you just saw, I can switch between the colors, they don't really get that hot, and you also don't use that much electricity. So it's kind of what's more important to you. Also inside of the spectrum menu, we can be told what the color temperature is, which is what CCT stands for, and the delta UV, and the RA, also known as CRI score. So that was the spectrum mode. Now let's look into the spectrum comparison mode. This is almost identical to spectrum mode, but this time you can compare three lights in the same view to see how close their spectral fingerprints match. First, you take a reading of a light, then store it by hitting the memory button found underneath the power button on the left side of the unit. Then take a reading of a completely different light, store that one as well. Lastly, measure one more light. Now that visible spectrum will appear in the graph, and we are going to recall the first light that we metered by tapping this box. And then look for the first light that we had in our meter. With it highlighted, press OK. As you can see, a yellow line has appeared in our graph, which represents the spectrum of light that we just recalled. We can turn it on and off by hitting the check mark in the box. We can also see the name that we called that reading, the CCT, and the delta UV that we stored with the previous light reading. And if we want to compare it to the second light that we metered, we can go to the third slot, tap it, then select the second light that we metered, and then press OK, and we will now have a red line that's representing the second light that we metered. And this is a great way to compare 3 lights' spectral fingerprints to see how close of a match one light is over the other. And as you can see here, this goes back to what I was saying before about the blue spike in the LED compared to a real tungsten unit. While they are very, very close, there is an obvious difference. So that's spectrum and spectrum comparison modes. We're now going to move over to episode 95C, where we're going to talk about CRI, TLCI, and TM30-18.